Good morning, everyone. This is Professor Hill. This is a short video for our class, Ethics Philosophy 2306, here at St. Philip's College. It's Tuesday, the 20th of February, 2018, and we're in week 6. We're looking at chapter 6, and we need to do a couple of things. I want to do a little housekeeping first, and then I want to introduce some of the key concepts from the chapter. But it turns out, first of all, I had told you that yesterday I would do a little wrap up about the last case study, and I forgot to do that. This was the group study problem, and as you found out by looking at the case study, it was a kind of a classic story of one student who fails to fully participate, but then shows up at the end with his own work, wants back into the group, wants to make everything okay. And then gets into the situation where he offers his classmates money for the time that they spent doing his work when he was out of touch. They weren't sure. They figured, look, we've got to make this up. And they don't take the money. But some of the students want to take the money. Other students think, oh my gosh, no, this is wrong. We can't take the money. And it all ends up going to the professor, and the professor's like, oh my gosh. So they lay the whole story out for him, and the professor had to decide what to do. And in the actual case, the professor contacted the dean. The dean said, I don't know whether there's an academic violation if the student did his own work, and now he wants to present his own work. I understand the group's not happy, but it's up to you, professor, whether you have them do it all together or separate, whatever, but I'm not going to pursue anything in terms of an academic fraud. Well, it turns out that the professor, still not sure about this whole thing, went over and talked to the dean of students. And because he wanted to make sure, well, look, maybe there's not an academic violation, but maybe this whole thing with the money somehow violated the code of student conduct. And at that point, the dean of students says, look, I don't think there wasn't any money that changed hands. And the professor goes, yeah, but there was still the offer. Even if it's not a completed action, there was still this, maybe an attempted crime. And the law, by the way, around attempted crime versus completed crime is really a fascinating area of law. And a lot of times you can be found guilty of attempted crimes even if they don't get completed, even if the money doesn't change hands. The offer can be a violation. Well, the dean says, no, look, that might be in the legal world, but under our code of conduct, we didn't envision that, so I don't think that there's a problem. So the professor went back, thought about it, realized, look, it's completely up to me, said, look, we're just going to go forward, and said to the students, you're going to all present together. You're all still in the same group. Present your work. And then what he did, which was an interesting thing, was he gave the same high grade to all the members who had done all the work and completed. And then the one student, he marked down. And he marked him down not because his work wasn't very well done, it was, but he marked him down in the end essentially for failing the assignment which involved the cooperation with the group. And he said, look, you're going to get a lower grade because you didn't participate, because you weren't in contact with the rest of your group, essentially because you are a lousy member of the group, not because your work was bad, not because you slapped these $100 bills on the table. He just kind of wrote all that off, and then they moved forward. And what was interesting was the students were basically all happy with that. The professor was happy with that, and the two deans were happy with that. But then the question becomes, are you? Now, obviously, there were some mixed reviews in the responses. And I've almost finished going through all of them. I've looked at most of them, but I haven't finished. I'll try to finish today now that it's Tuesday. The next case gets even more complicated, and I imagine we'll split even more because it comes back again to this thing about not attempts. But in this case, what's the culpability? What's the responsibility of the student? Because is there even a threat? And again, this is the case of the student's cartoon, and the student writes a very threatening cartoon. So there's no doubt the student does it. And the professor gets the threatening cartoon and is scared by it. But now the question becomes, is the student responsible for it? Because he did the cartoon in class, but then wadded it up, threw it away. And somebody else who was looking over his shoulder saw it, was concerned, and said, "Oh my God, he's threatening the professor." So went and fished it out of the trash, uncrumples it, takes it to the professor and says, "Look, this guy's thinking about killing you." And then the professor gets all freaked out. And, you can see the divide right here, which is that the student says, "Oh my gosh, what are you talking about? I was just doodling. I would never threaten a professor. I would never have given that to the professor, and I didn't." And the professor's take is, "You did this. It's in my hand. You're a threat to me." And you can kind of see that the perspectives are quite different on this. So we're going to have to figure out what's the right thing to do in this case. This was one that went right to the dean, landed on the dean's desk, and the dean's got to sort this out. So is that a threat? Is it not? What do you do if you have a zero tolerance policy? Does it apply in this situation? And I got to tell you, you can see where you're going to end up with people on both sides of the fence for this one. Anyway, that's the case study that's upcoming, due Sunday night, the 25th. We're looking at Chapter 6, and we want to make sure that we apply some of the concepts from Chapter 6 to that case study. And this whole chapter is about non-consequentialist theory, do your duty. And it says, look, we've been talking about consequentialist theory, looking at the outcomes to determine what's the right thing, what's the bad thing. Now we're going to be looking at non-consequentialist, or deontology, and we're going to look at two big schools of thought on this side of the divide. The first is the philosophy of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He was a 18th century philosopher who talks a lot about this side, again, the non-consequentialist piece. And then later you'll also see a natural law view theory. Those are the two kind of different approaches that are both on the other end. They're saying, look, it's about rules and principles. It's not about the outcomes. Forget the outcomes. And just to make that kind of clear, I'd mentioned previously some examples where it seemed that consequentialists made the most obvious sense. We were talking about distributive justice and things like taxes and where the roads go. That seems to make complete sense. Other cases I mentioned, like finding the wallet with $1,000 in it. And you think, woohoo, I got $1,000. And then you look in the wallet and there's a name and a phone number and an email and an address. And you're like, oh, I should return this money. Even though it would benefit me to have $1,000, now I know who it belongs to. I've got a responsibility and a duty to return it, even though it cuts against my personal interests. Well, that's where we are now. This is the side that says, no, look, there's some rules, there's some principles that you should follow, even if it's not something you would like to do. And that's where Kant gets introduced here at the beginning of our chapter. And he talks about two different types of commands or principles that are imperatives, meaning things that we should do. And with that, there's also these duties that come with that. It's like if you're in the military and your commanding officer gives you a lawful order, that command comes with an obligation to follow it. So that you can see how those things go together. Well, he talks first of all about two different types of those commands, the hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. And the hypothetical, he says, is look, this is the type of thing that if you desire it, if you want that, then this would fall into the category of hypothetical. And he says, look, it's like if you need money, if you want money, go to work. If you want orange juice, order some orange juice or go get some out of the store. Take some action to do that. And that's okay because it's something you want. And there's a command that flows from that. And that's different from the other type, the categorical imperative. That's the one which it doesn't matter what you want. You got to follow that no matter what. These are the rules or principles which come with a perfect duty to follow it. Okay? So, and he talks about how there's two different types of obligations, just like there's two different types of commands. There's hypothetical and imperative commands or imperatives, the categorical and hypothetical. And on this side, you've got both a perfect duty and an imperfect duty. Now, look, the example of a categorical imperative is simple. He says things like, don't lie. You can't ever lie. It's just a rule. And it turns out that when you look at the duty to follow it, he's going to say you always have a duty to follow that imperative, to follow that categorical imperative. You should just never lie. Well, that's a pretty tough one. We're going to circle back to that. But you can see the difference between both a hypothetical and a categorical imperative and a perfect and imperfect duty. Now, that's just kind of the general introduction. I want you to read through chapter 6, especially at the beginning where they're talking about continence theory, and get a sense of some of the principles he's talking about, but also, again, some of the examples will help clarify that. When we're talking about like the duty to follow, the imperfect and perfect, the perfect duty would go with a categorical imperative like don't lie. It doesn't matter whether you want it or not, doesn't matter, you got to follow it. If you don't like the circumstances, doesn't matter, you still got to tell the truth. Other things he gives as examples like developing your talents, even helping other people in need. Those are obligations or principles that are good things and you should do them, but you have an imperfect duty. And so they're going to be things where you have more flexibility about, do I have to do this all the time? Can I do that right now? Can I put that off? How much or how little do I have to do this? There's some flexibility. There's not with the categorical imperative and a perfect duty to follow it. So that's an introduction to chapter 6. By the way, when you go through it, I want you to pay attention to something. When he's talking about Kant, you're going to see that remember back in chapter 2, I said that he's not an impartial referee. He's not somebody who's a teacher who's saying, these are these different theories out there. He's saying some are right and some are wrong, which is what chapter 2 was all about. He just said, look, objectivism is right. Here's what's wrong with all these other stupid things. And we kind of come back to that now. Now that we're up to this chapter and we're on the side of objectivist moral theories and we get to Kant, you'll see he kind of slips back and forth between this language. He both says, this is what Kant thinks. And at the same time, he'll switch to this language about, well, and he's right. So he kind of goes back and forth saying, even the things that Kant is saying, like there are some moral principles that are valid for everybody. Remember objectivism. And he gets to these rules and principles that Immanuel Kant is saying are categorical imperatives. He both uses the language of Kant thinks this, and then he'll switch and say, oh, and you can see that he's right because this is true. And it's very interesting. He does it in a subtle way to where sometimes you think, oh, he's just describing, Kant thinks this. But he reinforces that with his own personal perspective on it. So again, you got to remember, take it all with a little grain of salt, because he's not just describing Immanuel Kant. he's selling Immanuel Kant. And there's a big difference. So we want to make sure that we're sensitive to that as we read chapter 6. Now, you may agree with him. You may think, oh my God, this guy's, he knows what he's talking about. You might also want to say, well, look, hold on a minute. Let's look at all these different moral theories and try to understand them and try to come at this as a student saying, I'm learning about this. I need to know what's the good and bad about both sides. You got to kind of take a lot of this with a grain of salt because he's both describing and selling. Keep that in mind as you read chapter 6. And as you start to think ahead to the student's cartoon and the crazy situation. That's the case study for the week. So again, look, it's Tuesday, the 20th of February, 2018. We got time to go through chapter 6, to read it, to think about it, and to start applying that to our case study. That's what we're doing this week. So if you got any questions, give me a call. Look forward to talking to you soon. If you need me, let me know. Take care. Bye-bye.